It was supposed to be a normal research trip deep into the heart of the Amazon. The team had been studying rare plants that grew only in the damp corners of the rainforest. The air was heavy with the smell of wet soil, and every breath carried the taste of life itself. For weeks, everything had gone according to plan. The group had set up camp near a slow-moving river, surrounded by towering trees and the endless chorus of insects. They were tired, yes, but happy. They had collected samples, taken notes, and recorded the mysterious rhythms of the forest that few ever get to hear. Then, one night, the sky changed. Thick clouds rolled in without warning. The wind picked up, whispering through the leaves with an uneasy sound. By midnight, rain poured down with a force that felt alive, like the jungle itself was shaking in anger. Lightning struck somewhere close, and thunder rolled over the canopy like a beast roaring in the dark. The river near their camp swelled fast, eating the muddy banks and dragging branches and debris downstream. By morning, everything was chaos. The storm had torn down trees, washed away supplies, and damaged their only radio equipment. The road that connected them to the nearest village was gone, buried under landslides. The group was trapped in the middle of one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. They still had some food and water, but not enough for long. The thick jungle surrounded them on all sides, silent and watching. It was as if the forest knew they were now completely alone. They tried to fix the radio, but nothing worked. The wires were soaked, the batteries dead. For 2 days, they tried to build makeshift antennas, hoping to send a distress call. But even if the signal went out, who would hear it? The storm had cut off every form of communication for miles. Still, they refused to give up. They wrote a short emergency message, a simple cry for help, and sent it through a weak transmitter. Then they waited. At first, no one answered. The rain continued to fall in short bursts and nights grew colder. The fire barely stayed lit. They rationed their food carefully, 1 can of beans stretched between 4 people. They drank from filtered rainwater and tried to keep their spirits up. But behind every nervous laugh was the same quiet fear. What if no one was coming? On the 5th day, one of them climbed a tall tree to look for any signs of movement or rescue. From the top, the jungle stretched endlessly in every direction, green, thick, and alive. But there were no helicopters, no smoke, no paths. Only the sound of the forest, birds, insects, and the low hum of unseen life. He shouted for help, but his voice was swallowed by the trees. When he came down, his face said what everyone already knew. They were completely cut off. That night, something strange happened. While sitting near the dying campfire, they heard rustling in the darkness. At first, they thought it was a predator. Everyone froze. The noise grew louder, closer, until something stepped into the faint light of the fire. It wasn't a person, it was a large capuchin monkey. It stood there for a few seconds, watching them curiously, its dark eyes reflecting the flames. Then, just as quietly, it disappeared back into the trees. They thought nothing of it, after all, animals were common here. But that was only the beginning. The next morning, one of the group woke up early and saw something unusual. Near the camp, on a fallen log, lay a pile of half-eaten fruits. Bananas, some mangoes, even a few berries. None of them had been there the night before. It looked almost like someone or something had left them there on purpose. Confused but hungry, they decided to eat a few pieces. It felt like a small blessing in the middle of despair. No one questioned it too deeply, but deep inside, they wondered how those fruits ended up there. As the days passed, the forest seemed to grow more aware of their presence. Parrots screamed loudly whenever a storm approached, almost like warnings. At night, wild dogs howled in the distance, but never came close. Insects stayed away from their sleeping area, though they should have been everywhere. The group began to notice small, strange things. Their campfire never seemed to go completely out, as if the wind changed direction whenever it threatened to die. Sometimes they heard movement outside the circle of light, but nothing harmful came near. It was as though the jungle itself was keeping its distance, but also keeping an eye on them. Then came the moment that changed everything. One evening, while trying to build another fire, they heard heavy steps behind them, not the light steps of a monkey or the quiet crawl of a snake. These were deep, deliberate sounds. The kind that make your heartbeat slow down and your breathing stop. Everyone turned at once, their flashlights shaking in their hands. For a moment, the light caught 2 glowing eyes in the dark, large, calm, and unblinking. Whatever it was watching them closely. The group backed away slowly, too scared to speak. But the creature didn't move closer. It simply stood there for a while, then turned and walked away. When morning came, they found fresh paw prints near the camp. A jaguar had been there. The most feared predator of the jungle had come within a few feet of them, and yet they were unharmed. It was impossible to explain, but somehow it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like the jungle had sent a messenger to let them know, you are being watched, but you are not alone. Days turned into nights, and the fear of being forgotten began to fade a little. They still had no real food or hope of rescue, but something inside them changed. They started to listen to the forest instead of fearing it. They noticed how the birds grew silent before rain. They learned which plants held drinkable water. They stopped trying to fight the jungle and started working with it. In return, the forest seemed to offer small gifts, more fruits near their shelter, fewer insects at night, and strange calmness even when the wind howled through the trees. One night, while sitting in silence, they saw the same group of monkeys from before. The animals moved closer, carrying fruits and dropping them near the camp before jumping away. One of the group whispered, "It's like they know we need help." The others laughed quietly, but deep down they all felt the same wonder. The cry for help they had sent out days ago had somehow reached not just human ears, but the wild heart of the earth itself. Somewhere, miles away, that faint distress signal finally reached a rescue center. The authorities received it just before the battery completely died. They marked the coordinates and began planning a rescue operation, but the storm made it nearly impossible to reach the area. Helicopters couldn't fly through the thick fog and boats couldn't cross the swollen rivers. The rescuers decided to wait a few days for the weather to clear. They didn't know that every passing day mattered, that the people waiting for them were surviving only because the jungle had taken them under its wing. By the 10th day, food was running out again. The forest had provided fruits, but the team's strength was fading. They began to lose track of time. The days blurred together, yet something deep inside kept them holding on. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the strange feeling that they weren't really abandoned, that the world around them was listening. Even the smallest sounds felt alive. The rustle of leaves, the distant cries of birds, the hum of insects. It was like the jungle itself had become one living heart, beating alongside theirs. That night, the rain stopped completely for the first time in days. The air was still heavy but peaceful. The sky cleared enough for them to see stars through the cracks in the canopy. One of them whispered, "Maybe someone heard us." Another said softly, "Maybe something did." In that moment, a strange calm settled over them. They were still lost, still afraid, still waiting, but not hopeless anymore. The forest around them, which had once felt like a cage, now felt almost like a guardian. The fire crackled softly, and the sounds of distant animals filled the night, not threatening but comforting. They didn't know it yet, but help was already on the way. Their cry for help had indeed gone out into the world, carried through broken airwaves and stormy skies. But long before human rescuers began their journey, something else had already answered. The jungle had heard them. The earth itself had listened, and somewhere deep in the heart of that endless green world, the beasts of earth had begun to move. The days after the storm felt longer than time itself. The jungle was still heavy with moisture, and every step sent waves of mist rising from the ground. The air smelled of wet bark and decay, but also of life, wild, restless, and old. The survivors had built a small shelter from the remains of their tents and broken wood, but it wasn't much. It barely kept them dry, and each night they could hear the forest breathing around them. They didn't know how many days had passed since they sent that cry for help. Maybe 10, maybe more. Time didn't make sense anymore. The only thing they counted were the sunrises and the nights when the moon managed to peek through the thick clouds. Every morning brought the same routine: collect water, find something edible, keep the fire alive, and hope. They had stopped waiting for a helicopter sound. The sky was too quiet. The only voices they heard were the sounds of the forest, the chatter of monkeys, the hum of cicadas, and the distant growl of animals they couldn't see. But strangely, none of it felt threatening anymore. It felt connected, almost aware of them. The longer they stayed, the more they realized the jungle was not their enemy. It was watching them, yes, but with a kind of strange patience. One morning, they woke up to a strange sight. The small pile of fruits that had been left for them before had returned, only this time it was larger. There were ripe bananas, guavas, Even a few pieces of sugar cane. Some of them were half-eaten, but most were fresh. No human footprints were nearby, only tiny hand-like prints from monkeys. It was impossible to ignore now. The animals were leaving food for them. They didn't know why. Maybe curiosity, maybe kindness, maybe just instinct. But when you're hungry and desperate, you don't question miracles. They ate quietly, looking toward the trees where they had seen movement. They could feel eyes watching them, though never in a frightening way. It was more like being observed by a neighbor who didn't want to be seen helping. Later that day, while searching for dry wood, one of them slipped on a wet patch of moss and cut his leg badly on a rock. It wasn't deep enough to be life-threatening, but it hurt. They cleaned the wound with river water and covered it with a torn piece of cloth. But the next morning, when they checked the area, something unbelievable had happened. Right outside the camp, scattered on a rock, were leaves from a plant known for its healing properties. It was the same type they had been studying before the storm, rare and hard to find in that part of the forest. None of them remembered bringing it there. Somehow the jungle had delivered the cure right to their doorstep. They used the leaves to wrap the wound, and by the following day the bleeding had stopped. The pain had lessened. It was hard not to believe the forest was taking care of them. Maybe it wasn't magic. Maybe it was just how life worked when humans stopped trying to control it and started to listen. By the next few days, their sense of fear had shifted into something else. Respect. They spoke in softer voices, moved carefully, and even started thanking the forest out loud for every small blessing. The firewood was easier to find. Birds flew lower, watching them curiously. Even the nights, which once felt endless and dangerous, became calmer. They began to sleep without the constant fear of being attacked. Then something strange started happening at night. Each time the fire burned low, they would hear rustling in the bushes nearby. It wasn't the sound of something approaching to harm them. It was the gentle shuffling of movement, like small groups of creatures circling their camp. When they shined their flashlight, they caught glimpses of glowing eyes, monkeys, capybaras, wild dogs, and even deer. They were gathering around the humans, almost forming a silent ring of life. The group sat still, too moved to speak. The animals just stayed there, watching, breathing, waiting. Then, when dawn broke, they disappeared quietly into the forest again. It felt unreal. The forest wasn't just aware of them, it was guarding them. Days later, the rain returned, heavier and colder than before. The small shelter couldn't take much more. Water leaked through every corner, soaking their bags and clothes. They tried to move higher, away from the flooded ground, but the mud made it difficult. Their energy was fading again. Then, just before evening, the forest answered once more. As they sat under a tree trying to stay dry, they noticed something unusual in the distance. A flock of brightly colored macaws flew overhead, screaming loudly and circling above a particular direction. It wasn't normal behavior. The group followed the birds through the thick brush, pushing past vines and puddles. After walking for about 20 minutes, they stumbled upon an abandoned wooden structure. Half fallen, but still standing enough to provide shelter. It must have been built years ago by previous explorers. The macaws stayed perched above it, screeching until the humans went inside, as if guiding them to safety. When they finally sat down inside, soaked but grateful, the birds flew off silently into the sky. That night, they built a small fire inside the broken hut and shared the last of their canned food. The rain hammered against the roof, but they stayed dry. The forest had given them another gift, shelter. None of them could deny it anymore. The animals weren't just coincidences. The forest was helping them survive piece by piece, day by day. The next morning, one of the group members decided to explore a little further while the others rested. The jungle was dense but strangely quiet. As he moved through the undergrowth, he noticed a line of footprints, not human ones, but belonging to several different animals, leading in the same direction. It was as if they were all moving with purpose, heading somewhere together. Curious, he followed the tracks until he reached a small clearing. At its center stood an ancient tree, massive and scarred but beautiful. Around its roots were fruits, shells, and feathers. It looked almost like an offering site. He didn't touch anything. He just stood there, realizing how small humans were compared to this world. Maybe the forest had always been communicating. It was just that people never learned how to listen. When he returned to the camp, the others were talking excitedly. More fruits had appeared overnight, and the injured member's leg had nearly healed. They laughed, not from humor but from the strange joy of still being alive. For the first time since the storm, hope didn't feel like a lie. Meanwhile, far away, the rescue team had been watching the weather closely. The signal from the missing group had been weak but real. Every day they tried to reach the coordinates, but heavy rain kept grounding the helicopters. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks, they received clearance to attempt a flight. A small search team prepared to enter the jungle. They didn't know if the people they were looking for were still alive, but they had to try. Back in the forest, the survivors had no idea help was finally on the way. That night, the sky cleared for a brief moment. The moonlight slipped through the clouds, bathing the trees in a silver glow. The animals returned again. Monkeys swinging through branches, wild dogs resting near the hut, even a jaguar seen watching from a distance. No one felt fear anymore. It was as if all living things in that jungle were connected by the same invisible thread, responding to that single cry for help that had been sent so long ago. The fire crackled softly, the forest breathing all around them. One of the group whispered, "Maybe the world is kinder than we think." No one replied, but in the silence they all agreed. In that moment, something inside each of them changed forever. They had come to the jungle as researchers, studying life through microscopes and data sheets. Now they understood that life wasn't something to study, it was something to belong to. The forest had shown them what humanity had forgotten, that the earth listens, even when people don't. It sees the fear, the struggle, and sometimes it answers in ways no one expects. As they drifted to sleep, they could hear faint sounds, footsteps of animals moving through the trees, the flutter of wings, the low growl of the jaguar somewhere in the dark. But it wasn't frightening anymore. It was comforting, like being surrounded by silent guardians. The beasts of earth had heard their cry for help, and they were not leaving until the humans were safe. The jungle was alive that night, pulsing with quiet energy. The trees swayed gently, the fire flickered, and deep beneath the surface the earth seemed to hum softly, as if whispering, "You are not forgotten." The forest was calm that morning, almost too calm. Sunlight finally broke through the thick roof of leaves, scattering golden rays across the damp ground. It was the first clear day in what felt like forever. The air smelled different, fresh, alive, filled with the promise of something new. For the group who had been trapped for so many days, that sunlight felt like a miracle. It warmed their tired faces, and for a moment, they forgot the fear and exhaustion. They just stood there, letting the light touch their skin like a quiet blessing. They had survived storms, hunger, and nights that seemed endless. Now it was time to find a way out, or at least a sign that someone was coming. The radio still didn't work. The batteries were long dead. But even without it, they decided not to lose hope. The forest had helped them in ways no one could explain. Maybe it would lead them home too. While the others gathered fruits and firewood, one of them walked toward the river that curved through the trees. The water level had dropped a little after the storm. The current still ran fast, but the color had changed from muddy brown to clear green. Fish could be seen swimming near the edges. Birds sang loudly from the branches above, as if the whole jungle was waking up with them. The person kneeled by, the river filling a bottle carefully, and suddenly noticed movement on the other side. For a moment, fear kicked in. The water rippled and a shadow passed under the surface. But what rose up was not a predator. It was a small group of otters. They looked straight across the river at the human and made curious chirping sounds. Then one of them swam closer, carrying something in its mouth. It climbed onto a rock, dropped a small piece of bark near the edge, and slipped back into the water. On that bark was a bright red fruit, perfectly fresh. It was as if the little creature had brought a gift. The humans smiled for the first time in days. "Thank you," they whispered, though the otter was long gone. The simple moment felt magical, another reminder that the forest was still listening, still watching over them. When they returned to the shelter, they told the others what happened. Everyone laughed quietly, shaking their heads in disbelief, but none of them doubted the story. They had seen too many strange, kind things in that jungle to call it coincidence anymore. The forest seemed to understand their struggle. It wasn't just providing food. It was giving them reasons to keep believing. That night, as the fire crackled, the forest came alive again. Monkeys called from the treetops, their sounds echoing through the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, frogs sang in rhythm, and glowing insects floated through the air like tiny lanterns. The group sat close together, telling each other stories to stay awake. They talked about their families, their homes, and what they would do once they made it back. But under all those words was the same shared feeling that they were being protected by something far bigger than themselves. Then, in the middle of the night, the fire flickered and nearly went out. One of them got up to add wood, but stopped suddenly. Just beyond the shadows stood a large figure, tall, silent, eyes reflecting orange from the flames. It was the jaguar again. The same one they had seen before. For a long moment, no one moved. The animal stood still, watching them with a strange calm. It didn't growl or approach. It simply looked, then turned and walked into the trees, vanishing like smoke. No one spoke after that. But deep inside, they understood. The jaguar wasn't their enemy. It was their guardian. Somehow, the beasts of the jungle had taken it upon themselves to make sure no harm reached these strangers. Morning came softly, with mist rising over the river and dew sparkling on every leaf. The forest looked peaceful, almost gentle now. The group decided to explore further upriver. Maybe the water would lead them to higher ground where a helicopter could spot them. They packed what little they had, some fruit, a few cans, and the fire starter, and began walking. The jungle was thick, and every step felt like a climb through walls of green. But there was something guiding them. Birds flew ahead in short bursts, landing on branches just a few meters away, as if showing them which way to go. Whenever they hesitated, the birds circled back and waited. It became a rhythm. The birds flew, the humans followed. It didn't make sense, but in that forest, logic had already stopped mattering. After several hours, they reached a flat area covered with fallen logs. It looked like the aftermath of a storm, broken trees, scattered branches, and a faint trail of disturbed soil. They rested there, catching their breath. Suddenly, they heard a deep rumbling sound, not thunder, not an animal, but something mechanical. Their hearts raced. Could it be a helicopter? They looked up, but the canopy was too thick to see anything. The sound faded just as quickly as it came. Maybe it was far away. Maybe rescue was closer than they thought. Hope returned like a warm flame. They decided to make the clearing more visible. Using sticks and stones, they formed a large X on the ground. It wasn't much, but if anyone flew over, it might be seen. They stayed there the rest of the day, listening, waiting. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The forest grew quiet again, but not empty. They could feel the presence of animals all around, hidden, watchful, peaceful. That night was different from all the others. The group sat under the stars for the first time since the storm. The air was clear, the wind soft. A small family of monkeys slept on a nearby branch, curled together like children. Fireflies drifted lazily, lighting up patches of grass. Even the jaguar's distant growl sounded more like a lullaby than a threat. It was the jungle's way of saying, "You are safe tonight." They slept deeply for the first time in weeks. In the morning, one of them woke up early and noticed something strange again. Near the riverbank, where they had washed their hands the night before, were fresh fish laid out neatly in a row. 3 of them, still wet, untouched. There were no fishing tools nearby, no traps. The fish couldn't have just jumped there by accident. They were placed there. It was as if the jungle had decided that fruits weren't enough anymore. It was time to feed them properly. The group cooked the fish carefully over the fire and ate in silence. Every bite tasted like gratitude. They couldn't explain it, and maybe they didn't need to. It felt like nature had made a quiet promise to protect them until help arrived. By now, their fear had turned into connection. They started noticing details that would have gone unseen before. The way vines grew toward the sunlight, how ants carried food in perfect lines, how certain flowers only opened when rain was near. It was as if the forest was teaching them how to live in harmony. The same wilderness that had once terrified them was now their greatest teacher. Still, they couldn't stay forever. They needed to find open space for rescue. They followed the river again, walking slowly, resting often. Every few steps they could hear movement behind them, soft, rhythmic, careful. At first they thought it was just animals passing by, but when they looked back, they realized something incredible. A group of wild dogs was following them, not too close, not too far, keeping pace quietly. They didn't growl or bark. They simply walked behind like silent bodyguards escorting lost travelers. It was the strangest sight, and yet, it brought comfort. The humans walked ahead, and the animals followed, as though the jungle itself was making sure they didn't lose their way. As the sun began to set, they reached a rocky hill overlooking a wide valley. For the first time they could see the sky clearly. It stretched endlessly, a soft orange fading into purple. They could see far-off birds flying in patterns, and beyond, the trees, faint trails of smoke from distant villages. Civilization wasn't that far. They were close now. They built a small fire on the hill and waited. The wind carried the smoke high above the canopy. Maybe, just maybe, someone would see it. The sound of the forest grew softer as night took over. The monkeys quieted down. The insects hummed gently. The wild dogs curled up nearby, resting. And from somewhere deep below they heard the faint echo of a jaguar's call, steady, strong, and comforting. As they sat there watching the stars appear one by one, they realized something they would never forget. The cry for help they had sent wasn't just heard by radios or machines. It had reached the very heartbeat of the planet. The beasts of the earth had answered in their own silent language, through food, guidance, protection, and presence. They didn't need words. They didn't need to be asked twice. They had simply acted because that's what life does when it listens. The humans looked at each other, speechless, as the forest whispered softly in the night breeze. Everything felt alive. The ground beneath them, the air around them, even the stars above. It was as if the world had opened its arms and said, "You belong here." Far away, the rescue team had already started its final approach, guided by faint coordinates and hope. But deep in the Amazon, under a blanket of stars, the group didn't know that yet. For them, the jungle was still their only home, and for now that was enough. They fell asleep surrounded by the sound of breathing earth, unaware that by morning, everything would change. The night on the hill was quiet and still. For the first time since the storm, everyone slept peacefully. The fire had burned down to soft red embers, and the wind carried the smell of smoke through the trees. The wild dogs that had followed them lay close by, their bodies rising and falling in rhythm with the calm night air. The stars above were bright, scattered across the black sky like small promises that the darkness wouldn't last forever. When morning came, the first thing they heard was birdsong, louder than ever before. Dozens of birds filled the trees, calling and fluttering their wings. It was as if the forest itself was celebrating that they had survived another night. The air was warm, and sunlight filtered gently through the canopy. The group sat together, quietly thankful. They had no idea what the day would bring, but deep inside, something told them it would be important. After eating the last of the fruits they had saved, they began to pack their few belongings. They had no real map, but they had decided to follow the river until it met open land. It was their best chance of being seen from above. The path was rough, covered in roots and thick vines, but they moved slowly, helping one another through the dense brush. Every sound, the crunch of leaves, the drip of water from branches, felt like the heartbeat of the jungle itself. As they walked, they noticed something unusual. The animals around them were moving in the same direction. Birds flew ahead in groups, monkeys swung from tree to tree, and even smaller creatures like capybaras scurried alongside the riverbanks. It was almost like a great migration, but the animals weren't running from danger. They were traveling with purpose, following a path known only to them. The humans followed too, unsure where they were being led, but trusting the rhythm of the forest that had already saved them so many times. After several hours, the trees began to thin. The sunlight grew stronger and the sound of rushing water became louder. When they finally pushed past the last curtain of vines, they found themselves standing before a breathtaking sight. A wide, open clearing, with a waterfall pouring into a clear blue pool below. Mist floated in the air, sparkling in the sunlight. It was beautiful, peaceful, untouched. The group stared in silence, unable to believe their eyes. It was like they had stepped into another world, They decided to rest there for a while. The water was cool and clean, and they used it to wash their faces and fill their bottles. It was the first time in days they truly felt human again. The monkeys watched from the trees, curious but calm. Birds dipped into the water to drink, and even a family of deer appeared on the far side of the pool unafraid. Everything moved together, humans and animals, sharing the same space, breathing the same air. For a moment, the difference between them disappeared. One of the group members looked around and said softly, "Maybe this is why we're still alive. Maybe this place wanted us to find it." No one answered, but everyone understood the feeling. It was as if the jungle had guided them here for a reason. They gathered near the edge of the water and decided to build a larger signal fire. They had learned by now that smoke could travel far if the air was clear. Using dry wood and leaves, they started the fire and added green branches to make the smoke visible. Thick gray clouds began to rise, swirling upward into the sky. For the first time, it felt like they were doing something that might actually work. Maybe a pilot somewhere would see it. Maybe someone was already looking. While the fire burned, they sat near the water, resting in silence. Hours passed, and the light began to fade again. Just as the sun started to set, a loud cracking sound echoed through the valley. Everyone froze. It wasn't thunder this time. It was the sound of breaking branches, heavy footsteps coming from the opposite side of the clearing. The group looked toward the trees, hearts pounding, expecting danger. But what stepped out wasn't a threat. It was the same jaguar they had seen before. It moved gracefully, muscles rippling under golden fur marked with black rosettes. The great cat walked slowly, stopping near the edge of the pool. The humans stayed perfectly still, not daring to move. The jaguar turned its head toward them, eyes glowing in the fading light. Then it did something none of them expected. It looked up at the rising smoke, then back at them, and began walking around the pool's edge, heading uphill. It stopped after a few steps, turned its head again, and waited. The message was clear. It wanted them to follow. They hesitated for a moment, unsure, but instinct told them to trust it. The jaguar continued walking, slow enough for them to keep up. It led them through a narrow trail that wound around the waterfall and into a higher clearing. From there, the view opened wide. They could see miles of forest stretching to the horizon, and there in the distance was a patch of open land, flat and golden under the evening sun. It looked like a field, maybe a place where a helicopter could land. The group stood speechless. The jaguar watched them one last time, blinked slowly, and then turned back into the forest. Its movement was silent, like a shadow fading into the green. It was gone just as mysteriously as it had appeared. They didn't speak for a long time. They simply looked toward that distant field, hearts full of hope. It was as if the earth itself had opened a path for them. The beasts had guided them once again, just when they needed it the most. As night fell, they built another fire on the high ground. The air was cooler up there, and the stars looked closer than ever. They could see their smoke rising high into the night sky, glowing orange in the firelight. Maybe someone out there would finally notice it, but even if they didn't, they weren't afraid anymore. The forest had proven again and again that it was listening. When they tried to sleep, they could hear the sounds of the jungle moving below, the chirping of insects, the hoot of distant owls, the low growls of unseen creatures, but none of it felt dangerous anymore. It felt like music, like the forest was alive and speaking in its own ancient language. The group lay there under the stars, feeling something they hadn't felt in weeks: peace. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight touched the clearing. The fire had burned down, leaving only a trail of smoke rising into the blue morning sky. As they looked around, they noticed small signs that the forest had visited during the night. Fresh fruits near their feet, paw prints of different animals all around their camp, even a trail of feathers leading toward the river. It was as if every creature had come by to check on them, silently saying, "You're almost there." They began preparing to move again. The path toward the open field looked steep but reachable. As they gathered their things, a group of parrots suddenly flew overhead, their bright feathers flashing in the sunlight. They circled above the humans, making loud calls before flying in the same direction as the field. Once again, the forest was giving them a sign, so they followed. The journey uphill was hard. The sun grew hotter and their bodies were weak from days of exhaustion. But every time they thought about stopping, something in the forest encouraged them to keep going. A cool breeze when they were too tired, the sudden call of birds when they felt lost. Even the way the leaves rustled seemed to whisper, "Don't give up." By midday, they finally reached the edge of the field. It was real, a wide open space covered in short grass and surrounded by trees. They could see tracks on the ground, old tire marks from previous explorers or maybe supply drops. This was it. This was where they had to be. They fell to their knees, overwhelmed. The endless days of fear, hunger, and silence had brought them here, to the one place where rescue could actually find them. They set up another fire, this time larger, feeding it with green leaves and dry wood until thick smoke rose high into the air. Then they waited. As the sun dipped low, the forest around them began to glow in golden light. The same wild dogs reappeared at the edge of the field, watching quietly. The parrots settled on the branches above. Even the monkeys came, chattering softly as if cheering them on. All of nature seemed to have gathered to witness the end of their long struggle. The group looked at one another, tired but smiling. Somehow they knew that the beasts of Earth hadn't just helped them survive. They had walked every step of this journey with them. The wind changed direction, carrying the smoke far across the horizon. The sky began to darken and the air filled with the sound of wings and distant calls. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then faintly in the distance they heard a sound, a low, steady hum growing louder by the second. They looked up, eyes wide. The sound grew clearer. It was the sound they had dreamed of for weeks, a helicopter. Tears filled their eyes as they waved their arms wildly, shouting and jumping. The animals scattered into the trees, but not out of fear. It was as if their work was done. The beasts of Earth had answered the cry for help, and now, at last, the humans would be found. As the helicopter hovered above the clearing, lowering toward them, the group looked back one last time at the forest that had saved them. The trees stood tall, the river shimmered in the distance, and somewhere out there a golden jaguar moved silently through the green, watching. The earth had listened. The jungle had spoken, and when humans had called for help, the beasts of Earth had answered in the only way they knew, with life, with instinct, and with heart. The sound of the helicopter's blades filled the open air like thunder breaking through a long silence. The wind whipped across the clearing, flattening the grass and shaking the trees. The group stood frozen for a second, almost unable to believe that what they were hearing was real. Then all at once they waved their arms, shouted and jumped, desperate to make themselves visible. The dark shape of the helicopter grew larger as it descended, sending dust and leaves swirling all around them. They could see the pilot inside, pointing down, signaling that he had spotted them. The roar of the engine was deafening, but no one cared. After everything they had been through, the fear, the hunger, the endless nights of not knowing, they were finally being seen. The smoke from their fire had done its job. The jungle had led them exactly where they needed to be. When the helicopter landed, the air became thick with dust and debris. The group shielded their faces as the side door opened, and 2 rescue workers jumped out wearing bright vests and helmets. Their eyes widened when they saw the survivors standing there, covered in dirt and scratches but alive. One of the rescuers spoke through a headset, his voice breaking with emotion as he shouted, "We found them! They're alive!" The group couldn't hold back their tears anymore. Some fell to their knees, others hugged each other tightly. They were shaking, not from fear this time, but from pure relief. It felt like waking from a nightmare and realizing the sun had finally risen. The rescuers quickly checked them one by one, offering water and medical packs. They looked thin and tired, but their hearts were stronger than ever. When everyone was ready, they began helping them into the helicopter. But before stepping inside, one of the survivors turned around and looked back at the forest. The sunlight had softened, casting long shadows across the trees. Birds flew overhead, and from somewhere deep within the jungle came a low, distant roar. It was almost like a farewell. The person smiled weakly and whispered, "Thank you." The helicopter lifted off slowly, rising above the field. As they climbed higher, they could see the vast stretch of green beneath them, the rivers, the waterfalls, the thick canopy that had once felt endless. It was hard to believe they had walked through all of that. From above, it looked peaceful, even gentle, hiding the dangers and struggles they had faced. The animals that had once seemed wild and unpredictable now felt like old companions watching from below. No one spoke for a while. The sound of the blades filled the silence. Everyone just stared out the windows, their eyes reflecting both relief and sadness. They were going home, but part of them felt like they were leaving behind something sacred, something that had protected them when the world forgot them. As the helicopter flew farther away, one of the rescuers began speaking over the intercom, telling them that their distress signal had finally been picked up after days of searching. The storm that had destroyed their original campsite had also disrupted communications, making it almost impossible for satellites to locate them. It was the thick smoke from their final fire that had caught a pilot's attention during a supply run. Hearing that made them realize how close they had come to being lost forever. If not for the animals guiding them, they might never have reached that clearing. The thought sent a shiver through them, not of fear, but of deep gratitude. The helicopter finally reached a small base camp near the edge of the jungle. When the doors opened, warm air rushed in, and the smell of clean smoke and cooking food greeted them. People were waiting there, medics, officials, and even a few journalists who had been following the search. Cameras clicked, voices called out, but the survivors were too exhausted to respond. They were gently led to a tent where doctors examined them. Their clothes were torn, their skin bruised, but their eyes were bright with life. As they sat on folding chairs, wrapped in blankets, one of them asked softly, "How long has it been?" A medic checked the notes and replied, 17 days since the crash, 17 days. It felt like a lifetime. In those days, they had seen what most people never would, the raw, wild side of Earth that existed beyond roads and cities. They had seen nature at its harshest and its kindest. They had seen beasts who acted more like guardians than predators. When the doctors finished checking them, they were given warm meals and water. They ate slowly, not rushing, letting every bite remind them that they were safe. Afterward, they were allowed to rest in cots under a large tent. The sound of generators hummed in the background, a reminder that they were back among machines and people. But even then, sleep didn't come easily. Their minds were still in the forest, listening to the sounds of the jungle, the whisper of leaves, the calls of unseen creatures, the soft rumble of the river. Later that night, as the camp settled down, one of the survivors stepped outside. The stars were bright above, but the jungle edge looked darker now, almost mysterious. He stood there quietly, breathing in the humid air. From somewhere far away came the faint call of a bird, then another. It sounded like a message. He didn't know why, but he felt like the forest was saying goodbye. A soft wind rustled the grass, and for a moment, he could almost see shapes moving among the trees. Shadows of the animals that had walked with them, the monkeys that had warned them of danger, the wild dogs that had protected them, and somewhere out there, the jaguar that had shown them the way. He whispered a simple "thank you" again before going back inside. The next morning, news of their rescue spread quickly. Radios, television, and social media were filled with headlines about the lost survivors found deep in the wild. Reporters wanted to know how they had survived so long without help. But when asked, none of them gave a clear answer. They simply said that the forest took care of them. A few days later, helicopters came again to take them to the city. From the air, the green sea of trees stretched endlessly below. The rivers glimmered like silver snakes under the sunlight. But the survivors could all feel the same thing. The jungle was watching them leave. And deep down, they knew that a part of them would always belong to that place. In the city, people welcomed them like heroes. There were lights, cameras, and applause, but the survivors didn't see themselves that way. They had learned something far beyond bravery. They had learned that life wasn't about control or fear. It was about connection. They had seen how the earth itself had reached out to them, how creatures once called wild had shown them compassion and guidance. They spoke softly when they were asked about their experience. "We were never truly alone," one of them said during an interview. "The jungle was alive. It knew we were there. The animals, they didn't hurt us. They led us. They understood something we didn't. People were fascinated by the story. Scientists called it instinct. Others called it coincidence. But the survivors knew it was more than that. They had felt something that couldn't be measured or explained. A silent bond between humans and the natural world. A reminder that Earth wasn't just a home, but a living being that listened when someone cried for help. Weeks passed and life slowly returned to normal. Yet every now and then, one of the survivors would wake up in the middle of the night feeling like they heard rustling leaves or the distant growl of a big cat. It wasn't fear, it was memory. The forest had marked them, not with scars, but with a strange peace that came from knowing how small yet precious life truly was. One evening, a small reunion was held for all of them. They met in a quiet park surrounded by trees. The sounds of the city faded as they sat together, talking and laughing softly. It was strange being back among streetlights and cars after living so long in the wild. The air smelled different, less real somehow. As the sun began to set, one of them pointed toward the horizon. "Look," they said. A flock of birds flew overhead, moving in perfect formation, heading west toward the setting sun. For a long time, no one spoke. They all watched silently, the same feeling stirring inside them again, that the world was full of unseen connections, small and quiet but powerful. When the birds disappeared into the distance, one of them smiled faintly. "They're saying goodbye," someone whispered. "No," another replied softly. "They're reminding us to remember." The night grew darker and the stars began to appear one by one. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, and the sound made them all glance up. They smiled again because deep inside they knew it wasn't just a dog. It was an echo from the jungle, a reminder that the beasts of Earth still listened, and that maybe someday someone else who was lost would be guided by them too. The Earth never forgot those who respected it. And sometimes when the world went quiet enough, it answered back. After the rescue, life slowly returned to what most people would call normal. But for the survivors, nothing would ever feel completely ordinary again. They were back in the city, surrounded by buildings, streets, and the constant hum of traffic. The bright lights and crowded spaces were overwhelming at first. Even the simplest things, like walking on pavement, drinking clean water without thinking, and hearing human voices instead of jungle sounds, felt strange. The world they had left behind was familiar, yet it seemed smaller now, quieter, and somehow less alive than the jungle that had saved them. Despite the chaos of returning to civilization, the group kept in touch, meeting often to share their memories, photographs, and the stories they could remember from the forest. They talked about the small things that had mattered most: the smell of wet soil after rain, the gentle rustling of leaves at night, the way the river water sparkled under sunlight. They laughed quietly about the way a family of monkeys had seemed to judge them from the trees, or how the wild dogs had appeared exactly when they were tired and almost hopeless. Each story carried a feeling of awe, a sense that the world they had experienced was far bigger, older, and wiser than the one they had thought they knew. In the first weeks after the rescue, doctors and volunteers checked their physical health. They were fed, given medicine, and given time to recover. But their emotional and mental recovery was a different kind of challenge. For many nights, the survivors would wake in cold sweats, still hearing the distant calls of creatures in the jungle, imagining the gentle rustle of branches, the quiet footsteps of animals following them, or the jaguar watching them silently from the shadows. At first, these memories were unsettling, but over time, they began to feel like something comforting rather than frightening, a reminder of what they had endured and the incredible help they had received. When asked by reporters about the experience, each of them spoke carefully. They described the storm, the isolation, and the fear, but they also spoke of the kindness of the forest and the animals. "We were never truly alone," one said. "Every time we thought we couldn't go on, something guided us, something watched over us, even when we didn't understand it." They didn't need to explain how or why. It wasn't about humans or machines. It was about connection. It was about the silent, patient presence of life all around them, reminding them that survival was not just luck, but care that existed in unexpected forms. Friends and family were overjoyed to have them back. Tears, hugs, and stories filled the first days. Yet amidst the comfort of loved ones, the survivors found themselves thinking often about the forest, the place where fear and trust had lived side by side, where their lives had been saved not by luck but by the subtle intelligence of nature. It was hard to explain this to people who had never been there. Many couldn't understand how animals had guided them, or how the forest seemed to respond to their cries, but for the group it was undeniable truth. Weeks passed and life started to settle into routines. They returned to work, met friends, and slowly caught up on the world they had missed. But the forest had changed them. Their priorities, their perspective on life, even the way they moved through the city streets, all were subtly different. They noticed the small details that often went ignored: the rustle of a bird in the park, the way trees swayed in the wind, or the quiet hum of water in fountains. They had learned to see life everywhere in ways that most people overlooked. One day the group decided to gather in a quiet park, a place with trees, grass, and a small pond. It wasn't the jungle, but it reminded them of the life they had experienced. They sat together, speaking softly about the moments that had shaped them, the day the jaguar led them to the clearing, the night the wild dogs kept watch, the way the parrots had guided them to the open field. Every story was filled with awe and gratitude. They realized that the animals had been more than companions. They had been teachers, showing them courage, patience, and trust in ways humans rarely experience. In the evenings, some of them began journaling, writing down memories that felt too vivid to forget. They described the colors of the river, the patterns of sunlight through the trees, the quiet sounds of life in the dark. Some sketches appeared alongside their writing, rough outlines of the jaguar, the wild dogs, the parrots, even the waterfall clearing that had felt like a sanctuary. They wrote because they wanted the experience to last, to preserve the lessons the forest had given them, and to share with others the incredible way the earth itself could respond to those in need. Despite the attention and the media coverage, they didn't feel like heroes. In their hearts, they felt like witnesses to the quiet power of the world and the unexpected kindness of creatures that many considered dangerous or indifferent. They often spoke privately of one thought that had never left them, that life, in its simplest and wildest forms, had the ability to protect, guide, and teach in ways humans could never fully understand. They started small projects inspired by their experience. They planted trees in the city, restored small areas of green space, and volunteered with wildlife programs. Every time they did this, they felt closer to the forest that had saved them. They also shared their story with local schools, encouraging children to respect and notice the life around them, small insects, birds, and even stray animals. They wanted others to understand that nature was not something to fear, but something to honor and listen to. Even months later, the smallest things reminded them of the jungle, a squirrel jumping between branches, the way the wind whispered through leaves, or the sudden call of a bird at dawn, all brought memories flooding back. And with each memory came gratitude, not sadness. The forest had given them more than survival. It had given them a sense of belonging, a connection to the world that could never be broken. Occasionally, they would meet and speak about the animals they had seen. They laughed about the monkeys that had seemed so curious about every move, the wild dogs that appeared when exhaustion threatened them, and the parrots that seemed to guide them like little bright arrows in the sky. And there was always the jaguar, the silent guardian whose presence had left the deepest mark on their hearts. They realized that what had saved them wasn't just the animals themselves, but the way the entire forest had moved together in a quiet, unspoken harmony to help them survive. The experience also changed how they approached challenges. They were no longer afraid of uncertainty or being alone. They understood now that help could come in ways they did not expect, that sometimes life itself in its purest and wildest forms would answer cries for help when humans could not. They had learned trust not in people alone, but in the larger world, in the pulse of life itself. Years later, they would remember the jungle as a living teacher. In moments of doubt, they thought of the clear water, the vibrant birds, the silent jaguar, and the loyal dogs that had walked beside them. They carried the lessons with them: patience, respect, trust, and the awareness that even in the darkest and most uncertain times, life had a way of responding to those who reached out for it. The story of their rescue became more than a tale of survival. It became a reminder that humans were not separate from the earth. They were part of it. And when humans acted with respect and humility, the earth in its many forms responded in ways that were subtle but powerful, life-saving and life-affirming. In quiet moments, they would sometimes sit alone, close their eyes, and feel the forest around them. They could almost hear the rustling of leaves, the whisper of the wind, and the soft padding of paws on the forest floor. And they would smile, because they knew that somewhere out there the jungle was still alive, still watching, still remembering. And in a way only they could understand, the forest had never really let them go. They had cried for help, and the beasts of earth had answered. They had survived storms, fear, and uncertainty. They had walked among creatures that many feared, and had been guided by them in ways no map, no compass, no human could provide. The experience had changed them forever, leaving them with gratitude, awe, and a lifelong connection to the living world. And even as they returned fully to the human world, with its buildings, roads, and routines, the memory of the forest stayed with them, an invisible thread linking them forever to the heartbeat of life, the wisdom of the wild, and the quiet, patient guardians that had once answered their call. Life went on, but they never forgot. They knew, deep in their hearts, that when the world is alive and listening, help can arrive from the most unexpected places. Sometimes it comes not from machines or humans, but from the earth itself through its creatures, its rivers, its trees, and its endless, patient life. And they would carry that lesson for the rest of their lives, a reminder that the world is full of guardians waiting quietly to answer cries for help, if only humans would notice and listen.